Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
It's a very great pleasure to introduce Dr. William Struthers, Bill Struthers, from Wheaton College in the USA. And he received his PhD in biopsychology from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and he's associate professor of psychology at Wheaton, where he's an award-winning teacher and scholar. Teaches behavioral neuroscience and psychopharmacology. His lab research interests are in the neural mechanisms that underlie behavioral arousal and the processing of novel environments. And his theoretical research is in the area of neuroethics, the biological bases of spirituality, personhood, and the nature of the integration of psychology and the Christian faith. So I think we're going to get another very interesting perspective for today. Thank you, Bill. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Holder and Alexander, for the invitation to come. One of the things that is, I think, really interesting about being at a college like Wheaton, as I've been able to come over here a couple times to visit the UK, is the nature of the university system over here is very different than it is in the States. And in Wheaton, it's very different than it is throughout the States as well, because part of my tenure requirements at Wheaton are to write papers on the very nature of the integration of my faith with my discipline. Wheaton is an explicitly Christian college. You've perhaps heard of Billy Graham, who's perhaps the most famous alumni of the college. I have my office and my lab in the Billy Graham Center, so it's always very fun to tell people abroad about that. But my training is, as Dr. Holder mentioned, primarily in neuroanatomy and neuropharmacology. So I feel a bit odd being in the psychology department, but don't feel I properly belong in the biology department, because I do very much enjoy the realm of the mind and behavior, which I think is properly considered the object of psychology. Now, I was asked to give a presentation on the mind-body problem, and I believe you might have the wrong handout. If my eyes, I noticed I saw a picture on the back of it.
On its way.
Correct one's on its way then. I saw a picture on the back which I know to be from my lecture this afternoon, which I hope you'll find will contain many more neuropsychological and neuroscientific bits of evidence than I'll be presenting here in the morning. Because I find that in my training of graduate students at Wheaton, where we have a doctoral program in clinical psychology, much of my time is spent trying to convince the professing Christians that a substance dualist view might not be the correct one, that there might be a better way of thinking about what it means to be human. And this, I think the entry point for this is of course the mind-body problem. The mind-body problem is not unique to psychology. It's been around since antiquity, I would think. Theologians have had much to write about it. Philosophers have had much to write about it. Psychology is a relatively recent discipline, so they haven't written as much about it as some of these other disciplines are. But even more recently, physicists and biologists have much to say about the nature of this interaction. And we've already heard from Dr. Clark earlier a bit about these kinds of problems. One thing that Dr. Clark mentioned, where's he at? That your wife didn't like it, the dressing table. I would routinely bring home rodent brains from my laboratory because of the procedure that I would need to transfer them to prepare them for cryogenic slicing. And she would open up the refrigerator door to find series of rat brains. Oftentimes, they would have times where I would switch over, so I can appreciate that. But even as a graduate student, as a person of faith, being a Protestant Christian in the Reformed tradition, I do think that it is important that we consider, what Scripture has to say about the problem. And I think if you look at some two contrasting starting points here, one from Genesis 1:26, which we've seen a little bit already. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image and after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created him. And this, of course, is contrasted with one of the UK's most notorious exports to the US, Richard Dawkins. "We are machines built by DNA whose purpose is to make more copies of the same DNA. That is exactly what we are for. We're machines for propagating DNA, and the propagation of DNA is a self-sustaining process. It is every living object's sole reason for living. Now, these are very clearly different perspectives. Dr. Clark mentioned at the end of his talk, and it might have even been during his question and answer period, this notion of the image of God, that theologians have written quite a bit about the image of God. And Philip Hefner has written that for Christians, the image of God is instantiated normatively in Jesus. Although this assertion has had a long and rich tradition of interpretation, there is no consensus on exactly what it means. Here I think he's speaking among theologians. There is no single official or even standard interpretation of the concept of the image of God. And I think this is, as a Christian, very, very exciting, but at the same time, very, very difficult to get across to some people, because many people think that the image of God is what they seem to think it is. Some think that it's consciousness. Some think that it's reason. Some think that it's a sense of self. Some think that it is, as mentioned earlier, the capacity to relate to God, that that's what it is. So what about the atheists, right? Those who don't relate to God. And once again, getting into the issue of the Hebrew and the Latin translations here, we have these two terms, image and likeness. And I think that it is important to stop and consider those. That they're often used together. You see that the term image does pop back up again. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. And in Genesis 9:6, we find that whoever sheds the blood of man, by blood shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. We see it popping back up again. So we see, kind of coming back to this Hefnerian term here, what we're going to find is that there are many different theological perspectives on this. And as a Protestant raised in a Methodist church, I came sort of through the Methodist tradition in the United States, which probably looks very different than it does here in the UK. But what I did find is that as I went off to university and started thinking a little more deeply on this matter, I tended to drift a bit more to the Reformed theology and a Reformed view of the image of God. If you look at it carefully, tends to see this image as much more reflective. That is, who we are as human beings reflects who God is, that we reflect his nature. And there are some within the Reformed tradition that say that this is getting back to an ontological nature of who God is. If you ask a Jew who God is, or what is God, God is what? One, right? And God is spirit, right? So the notion of a spirit, and if you look once again, getting to that creation account of where God breathes into man, breathes the spirit into man, that is part of what this image of God means. And of course, this could very easily be seen as being an ontological substance, which is a soul. Within the Reformed view, you also see that there are others who argue that the image of God is reflected as we are God's representatives in creation. That we act as his agents in this world, that we are called to steward the garden, that we're called to care for creation, that we are his presence in this world. So this is a very different view that doesn't have anything to do, really, with us having sort of a spark of similarity in our ontological nature to who God is. So this notion of how we act, how we work our lives out in this creation. And getting back to that last passage from Genesis, that there's something sacred about God's nature, that we, in his image, have a sacred quality. That to kill a calf is one thing, to kill a rat is another thing, to kill, let's say, a fly is yet another, but to kill a human being, to kill man, is somehow a violation of a sacred trust that has been given to humankind. So within the notion of Reformed theology, you will find that the tradition of the soul, yes, it is present here in Reformed theology, but it is not the only position that's present. Now, I did mention that I come from a Methodist church. And those of you who are maybe familiar with Protestant theology know that there are other traditions, the Wesleyan tradition, which we'll come back to a little bit later because one of the individuals that was mentioned earlier, Warren Brown, is a very staunch Wesleyan in his theology. And I think this significantly affects his view of sort of this mind-body problem. And if we look at the Wesleyan tradition, what we find is that they also have three sort of parallel versions of this image of God problem. The first is that of what they refer to as the natural image. Sometimes this is referred to as the human being's capacity for reason. It is this natural image that gives us what some would call an immortal soul, although I don't think immortality, as Dr. Clark mentioned earlier, extends rearwardly, nor does it extend into the future. This natural image is also tied to the notion of free will and volition. And I think probably later on I will share that. I'm not quite sure I like the concept of free will. I'm much more comfortable with saying that human beings act willfully than saying that we have a will, that our will is not as free as we would like to think it is. So the scrambled eggs this morning would not have been an option for you to choose had they not been on the menu. And had they not all been eaten prior, so you wouldn't be free to eat them. Nor are you sort of determined by genetics or by neurological predisposition that you would always choose scrambled eggs if you maybe had a dream earlier in the evening of scrambled eggs chasing you around with a shotgun perhaps. You might not be as amenable to making the choice to eat scrambled eggs. But this notion of free will and affections also, that qualitative feeling of emotions, is tied heavily to the natural image. And if you know anything about Wesleyans, you know that they are, if not anything else, very exuberant in their expressions of emotionality. They love the passions of the heart. The heart of John Wesley, is one of the hallmarks of Wesleyan theology. Now, the second is that notion of political image or regency. This is sometimes referred to as the cultural mandate. In Reformed thinking, this is thought of that we act as God's representatives in nature. Well, Wesleyans agree with this as well, that our function is to sort of go out, to go forth and to multiply, to care for creation. And finally, we have the Wesleyan moral image, which is inherently relational, that man is created through joint activity. You look at the term, our, the plural that's used in the creation account, and many, certainly Christian scholars will say that this is sort of a foreshadowing of the Trinitarian nature of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that this term is used here. It is not him having a conversation with the angels during the creation process, and that the angels somehow share the same image that he will share with humanity, but is actually working within the triune Godhead, and that is why this plural term is used. And so here we get to the notion of human beings being in relationship to God, that there is the sense of righteousness, the sense of holiness, and the sense of love that maintains that communion between individuals and humanity with the Creator. Well, if we can kind of step back and think of this from a psychological perspective, we can think of, as we've been talking quite a bit about, as the image of God as being inherently a substance. That is, it is an ontological thing, it's a soul, and that it is sort of a unique part of us that we somehow have to find a way to fit into our understanding of human nature. And it, of course, has Reformed and Wesleyan components to it. But you do see this playing out in quite a bit of the conversation about substance dualism and the mind-body problem. You also have, I think, a functional component. We talk about what is the function of the image of God, to be his representatives in this world. Is it that we have some sort of role to play in creation, that we have some sort of cognitive capacity that functions in such a way that gives us the unique characteristics that we have to do tensor calculus, which I certainly don't know how to do, and to kind of look at that as the primary thing that makes us who we are. And getting to one of the questions that was raised earlier as well, we seem to be very good at setting up nice little behavioral goalposts, we call them in the States, maybe rugby posts if you might want to think of them here in England, that we seem to say, well, human beings use tools, and we set up a goalpost. And then we find that animals are very nice at kicking the ball through the goalpost because they can do that. So we take a step back and we move the goalpost back a little bit further. And we say, well, we'll make it self-awareness. And set the goalpost up, and the animals have a very nice job of being able to kick the ball through the post. So we keep sort of moving back further and further, moving those goalposts to sort of maintain our integrity, to say that we are really unique. And it's a matter of what we can do that makes us unique, rather than the specific substance that we have. Now finally, we see that the third parallel here is that of the relational nature, that there's the sacred, moral, triune nature. Some theologians, in particular Karl Barth, looks at the sexual nature of humanity, that men and women are created, we were saying species, yes, but there is a relational component there. And I've written quite a bit about this. I tend to study sexual compulsions is one of my areas of human research. I look at individuals who are addicted to pornography or who have sexual addictions. And the notion of sexual relationship is very important to me. I think it's critical. And not to say that God is sexual, that's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying that the relational nature of God is in one way reflected in our sexual nature. But not just for the sake of pleasure, not just for the sake of procreation, but for the sake of kinship, for familial bonds. That sex, inasmuch, is about relationships between father and son, father and daughter, husband and wife, and any number of other relationships that you can think of. And there's appropriate relationships there. I am in one way with my wife that I'm not with my sisters. In another way with my brothers that I'm not with my sisters. And in another way with my daughter that I'm not with my sisters. So even though they share that relational nature of being female reproductively, the nature of the relationship is very, very different. And God lays out in His commandments what are appropriate behavioral expectations between different sexual relations. And so I find this is tied up in the notion of family very much. So in the States, we're very keen on saving people's souls, right? So we want to make sure that people don't go to hell and burn for eternity. So what we want to do is make sure that you save yourself from going to hell. And we oftentimes miss the part that you are saved into God's family, which I think is part of the beautiful story of the gospel that oftentimes goes sort of lost in the individualistic versions that you see in the West. Now, kind of moving a bit beyond this, I think, one term that has come up quite recently is the notion of embodiment, which I tend to prefer. I think it ties together these previous three quite nicely. I think it also kind of brings into it and assimilates the concepts of emergence that we see that have begun to pop up in Christian scientific and theological circles. But the interesting thing that you find is that much of this conversation of emergence and embodiment is really being pushed, not solely, but it is being pushed by the data that we're seeing popping up in neuropsychology and in neurobiology. So the emphasis on this is looking at brain structure and function, which we will come back to. So let's ask this one question before we go a little bit further. Are we unique? Are we unique genetically? Well, yes, we are. Are we unique in the way that our biochemistry functions? Well, yes, we are. Are we unique in the way that our physiology, neurology, morphology, cognitive abilities and capacities, our social dimensions, our social relationships that we work in, our moral nature? Are we religious? All of these things. Are we unique? Yes, we are. We need to get over it because everything else is unique too. That's kind of the point of speciation, isn't it? So the issue of uniqueness really is, for me, a non-starter. But what is interesting is this notion of the image of God being the one thing that sets us apart from the rest of creation. So tying it together in the conversation, I think, is critically important. But let's not be overly infatuated and go about navel-gazing at our own uniqueness at the risk of losing the fact that we are created and part of creation either. Well, some of these theological issues related to the mind-body problem, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, are in the Christian tradition, and these pop up in other versions in other religious traditions as well, whether it be Islam or in Judaism or Hindu religions or faiths. The critical ones, I think, for the Christian tradition are, first of all, what needs to be saved? Part of the Christian story is about Christ's incarnation, his death and his resurrection. For what purpose? For the purpose of saving humanity, bringing us back into communion with God. This is one of the first questions I think that we need to be thinking about as Christians. Secondly, what does this salvation entail? Does it entail the transporting of the soul to a heaven when a person dies, or to a hell when they die, based on a commitment that they have, or based on the deeds that they've done, or the decisions that they've made? Or does it play itself out in the current world? Thirdly, should we deny the world? If we take a Platonist view, and you do see this quite a bit, I've been to many churches where pastors will preach from the pulpit on Sunday morning. Don't worry about this body. Don't worry about it. You're going to die. Your soul's going to go to heaven. That's all you need to worry about. So don't worry about that cancer that's ravaging your body. Don't worry about any of these things that are going on in your body. And to me, that sort of smacks of Gnosticism. So do we need to deny the world in the process of doing this? Should we focus inherently on the spiritual world and to be preoccupied with some other level of reality that we have sort of this ability to touch into, at the expense of worrying about the physical world? Should our focus be on the eschaton, the going to heaven, or should we focus on this world at all? Should we just say, scrap it all, God's going to fix it at the end, so I'm just going to trudge on through, do the best that I can, and let God sort it out? How should our ministry be informed? How do we interact with each other? If the body's not important, then why bother caring for the sick? Let's just hurry up and let them die. That sounds ridiculous to say, but it could be a logically consistent position for some Christians. Now, I certainly don't hold that. I don't want you to think that at all. I'm just trying to lay out these are the kinds of questions that we have to grapple with. And this issue of, for example, how ministry should be informed comes quite a bit to the fore in my discipline, in people of faith deciding whether or not they should take medications for things like depression, or for their schizophrenia, or for obsessive compulsive disorders. Shouldn't this just be a spiritual battle that I'm fighting? If I pray hard enough and I read my Bible enough, why can't that be the solution to my problems? So this informs our ministry, and then of course this gets into the issue of how the church is involved in spiritual formation, the forming of individuals into those who are becoming more like Christ. Now I hope that this just isn't too kind of simplistic for you. For me, it's a good way to kind of think about it, to head forward. But I've heard the term often about human beings and persons and the notion of self and I, and this seems to me to be very static. And I tend to prefer thinking of human beings as becomings as well. That we are becoming into something. That it is not just about being in a place of sort of static equilibrium and trying to linger there for as long as possible, which could play itself out at a spiritual level as well. How people might become preoccupied with attaining holiness and then staying there for as long as possible. But thinking of this whole process as a sanctification process, whereby we are becoming more like Christ rather than becoming less like Christ, is an important way of thinking about it. Because if you think of it as a becoming process, then the issue of continuity really is an interesting one to think about. As I think Dr. Clark mentioned earlier, the atoms that are in our brains when we are born are most likely, the majority of them, not in our brains now. That we have different ones. We have a different structure to our brains now than we did when we were born, as opposed to when we didn't even have brains when we were conceived. So this notion of a progression of being, that human life is a biological process, that human beings do have psychological capacities, and that a person exists within a social network. These are critical things to think about, and are tied to a dynamic view of what it means to be human. And I think we're going to find tied to this notion of emergence as well. Now, I just put this slide up here just so that you know, so I could make sure that I was at least 15 minutes in and didn't go too quickly through them. So I find that I will have to speed up a bit. Well, the mind-body problem, I think, has, to my mind, four really critical questions, but it really comes down to one issue. The first question is, what are we going to consider as legitimate evidence for mind? Much of the conversation is complicated by one person's standard of evidence being very, very different from another person's standard of evidence. I, as a psychologist, am perfectly comfortable with using introspection as a legitimate piece of data. Many biologists are not. They're very uncomfortable with that. So this notion of evidence. So is introspection evidence for mind? I was going to make that a rhetorical question, but is it? And I think it's a significant philosophical question that is tied to the epistemological nature of science, because if you don't consider it, it's going to lead you down, don't consider it as data, it will lead you down a very different path than another. Well, what about the evidence for my body? I could very well not have a body, just drift into a solipsism, right? Where I'm really just a mind having a wonderful illusion or dream, and you are all not really here, but it's just convenient for me to dream in such a way that I think that you're here, and that I do have water in my hands and I'm walking around. So once again, it's an epistemological, philosophical question. And if we do decide that, yes, there are forms of evidence, well, what are they and how do they relate with each other? But I think at the end of the day, what we're going to find is that we do have to have, as Dr. Polkinghorn mentioned, I believe on Tuesday, we have to have some brute fact assumptions about the ontological nature of what it means to be a human being. Now, this is going to sort of lead us through any number of different sort of rabbit trails, one of which is an evolutionary perspective. You know, what value is there in having a mind? Presumably, it has some value. Might not, but presumably that having a mind or thinking of yourself as a self, as an I, and as a me as a series of components which make up who the I is, well, presumably this has some kind of adaptive value, either for reproductive or for survival benefit. And what about the psychological or subjective experience, that intuitive, sort of subjective aspect of our consciousness, which most people, I think, are very comfortable to confess to having. And I'm assuming that you sort of have a sense of self. We don't want to be solipsists. I won't for the moment. But most of us have a subjective sense of what it's like to be a person, that you think, oh, I need to scratch my head, and so you scratch your head. Or you think, I would like some scrambled eggs, and you have scrambled eggs. Or you think, oh, well, good heavens, he's so boring, and so I'm going to kind of look and see how much time we have left, or whatever. Right? That you have mental states which then elicit responses to them. So we get once again to this issue of the subjective experience seems to be very, very different from the rest of the world. And this, of course, leads us to what has been talked about quite a bit earlier, of substance dualism. In my conversations with Christians, both those in the pew and scientists, I find that there are really three positions that kind of are put out there. Substance dualism seems to be the one that the person in the pew tends to hold, that your average person on the bus, as was mentioned earlier, probably goes to. That I think of myself as a soul trapped in a body. Some would go so far to say as a neutered, asexual soul trapped in a sexed body. I think that's a critical thing to think about. But that is kind of our nature, and you can find any number of theologians and philosophers who will argue this at great length. Then you find, on the other end of the spectrum, you have the non-reductive physicalists, or those who generally tend to be much more monistic in their approach. These being Malcolm Jeeves, Nancy Murphy, Warren Brown, and they tend to fall at the other end of the spectrum. And they tend to be those individuals who are much more tied to this neuroscientific data. So the substance dualists are much more philosophical in their data, much more tied to subjective experience, whereas the non-reductive physicalists are much more tied to easily, well, I shouldn't say objective, more like intersubjectivity, but empirical data nonetheless. In the middle, you have those who I think are kind of coming up with some interesting middle points. William Hasker and the notion of emergent dualism, getting to this issue of emergence again. That as we get increasing levels of systems coming together, that you have higher level emergent systems that arise out of them. And we're going to hopefully get a little bit to that. But these are the three positions. And of course, our good friend, the much beleaguered straw man Rene Descartes, right? We throw him up whenever we want to address these issues of Cartesian dualism. I actually really enjoy Descartes, reading Descartes. I also think that Descartes is a wonderful example of the way that humanity oftentimes tries to tie the image of God and human nature to the best technology they have available. The best technology available at the time of Descartes was really hydraulic technology, hydraulic systems. And I enjoy the account that I've read of Descartes sort of walking through the gardens of Saint Germain, stepping on the stones, and the statue of Cupid comes sliding out from between the hedges and stepping off, and it slides back in. And that sort of tying back into his anatomist views of fluid going down through, which was entirely understandable at the time, the fluid going down through the nerves, going through the veins, the muscles, causing them to expand or contract, and looking at the brain as well. And I think this really getting back to, once again, going on at the time, I know Descartes' views were not sanctioned by the church or approved by the church, but getting to this notion of that soul, those two bits and pieces there, that spiritual substance that sort of sets them apart in a unique way from the rest of animals. Not animal soul, but that rational soul. And getting, once again, to the matter of Scripture, that humans have some sort of eternal soul that is treated differently by God, that animals don't. That humans, like God, will exist in the ever after, that we will live eternally. And that this soul is tied to our capacity to reason. It gives us also this moral goodness, and I believe it's John Calvin refers to the sensus divinitatis. I might be wrong on that. I believe it's Calvin. That this notion that we can sense God in a way that other organisms can't. I think it would be silly to try to deny that substance dualism as the strongest one, the strongest tradition in Christian history. But getting back to Descartes, as a neuroanatomist, I find it fascinating that Descartes locates it in the pineal. Because if you think about the pineal, it is located right around where the aqueduct coming from the third ventricle spills into the fourth ventricle. If you start slicing up the brain, it is really the only asymmetric body in the brain. It is located right in the center, towards the top, and it, for theological reasons, is wonderful. It's a single thing, right? It's high, so it's close to God. It's close to the fluid that's needed to be pushed down through into the spinal cord, out to the spinal cord, and out to the muscles. So this is the mechanism through which the soul exerts its will over the body. So rather than sort of beat up on poor old Rene, I think I can certainly see why, given his positing of these two types of stuffs, that he ran into the problem that he ran into, and that he tried to solve it in the way that he did. Now, so getting back once again to the pineal, unitary structure. Another unitary, what appears to be a structure, is the optic chiasm. Right as the optic nerves are coming in from the eyes, they cross over at the bottom of the brain. Looks to be a single structure, but it's actually just a decussation point for fibers. But Descartes' position, I think, is entirely understandable. I have great sympathy for him, given his technology at the time. But think about what has happened since Descartes. Brain has been thought of as being sort of a massive switchboard, right? Around the turn of the 20th century, we thought of the brain as being little switches that were connected to each other, a massive switchboard. And now we tend to use the terminology of computers when we talk about how the brain works. But the brain is not a computer. Right? Computers work via very systematic usage of binary code and hardware, and they work in digital. Most of them work in digital systems. The brain is not a digital system. Neurons have digital components to them. For example, the axon hillock, where you have that all or none threshold, where the neuron either fires or it doesn't. But if you look at the inputs to the neuron, they are incredibly analog. If you look at the outputs of a neuron, they are incredibly analog in the number of quantum that are released. Neurons can change the amount of neurotransmitters that they let in. They can alter the amount of calcium that they let into themselves at the terminal button, and they can change the manner in which they are influenced by other neurons, by upregulating and downregulating receptors, by upregulating and downregulating ion channels. So the brain is not a computer, and I think when we use that language, it's helpful to have a conversation about what's going on. But at the end of the day, it is a different system. It's a biological system. It's like a computer that's growing itself somehow. Now, pressing on here, coming back to this issue of the soul again. Descartes needed the pineal because the pineal was necessary for the soul to exert its control out of, or excuse me, onto the body. Well, there are lots of problems here, aside from the logical inconsistency. The pineal is not part of the telencephalons, but the diencephalon. The corpus callosum seems to be a much better alternative, and the septum also would seem to be a better alternative for positioning purposes. But I think at the end of the day, Descartes was really not striving for anatomical reality, but for metaphorical purposes. To construct this mechanistic approach, in many ways he was very similar to Galileo, that he wanted to sort of save the natural world from theology and supernatural world from science. I think if you read Smith's work on that, you see that an analysis of his letters and of his work seems to indicate this. And finally, Keith Ward wrote that Descartes was, remember hearing him say this with him, Descartes was not a Cartesian dualist. I thought that was such a wonderful quote that I had to put that up there. But this idea of the non-locality of mind, that it's an extension of spirit throughout the body, is very different, I think, than the way most philosophers think Descartes was writing about it. So, coming back to this notion of substance dualism. Well, we can have Cartesian substance dualism, where we have mental sort of stuff, or non-physical stuff, and physical stuff. But what about the nature of the way these two interact? It's one thing to say that you have physical stuff that generates non-physical stuff. It's another, I think the epiphenomenalists would probably want to say that there are sort of this, much like, for example, I think what was talked about earlier was a car. Someone mentioned a car. You know, if my car doesn't work, right, it's still a car. Well, I think some researchers would say, well, think of the human being as a car, and that consciousness or the mind is really like the exhaust. The exhaust itself isn't necessary for the running of the car, but the exhaust is produced by the internal combustion that occurs, and it sort of drifts out, and that's what the mind is. This is sort of the epiphenomenal dualist says, well, it's kind of different, right? It's sort of a different state in the metaphor that we're using, so it's not a perfect example. But it's sort of epiphenomenal dualism. And that the exhaust really doesn't do anything to change the car, but the car produces the exhaust. So it's a one-directional relationship, and there you have it. The interaction dualist says, well, one could cause the other. So a physical state could cause a mental state, and a mental state could therefore generate a physical state. So you have a nice little interaction that occurs between these. How it does it is the dualist problem, isn't it? And then, of course, you have parallelism, which is another form of dualism that says, yes, these two substances do exist, but they exist in parallel, and they don't interact with each other. They sort of go along quite nicely, and you can see identity theorists sometimes will kind of grab onto this as well. So we have a parallel version a parallelist version of dualism as well. So where does, coming back once again to the theological points, the soul here is important. The soul is important for morality. It's important for reason. It's important for emotion. It's important for our sense of self. It's also important to deal with some of these tricky theological issues, like what happens to us when we die? Where do we go? We need to have an intermediate state, presumably, that we go to prior to the resurrection. And this, I think, is dealing with the issue of the eschaton in sort of a backward fashion that I'll want to come back to in just a moment. So these issues of causation, right? We need to have causes for our morality, that our soulish state causes us to have moral status, that it is our soulish state that has reason, that it is our soulish state that feels emotions, that has this sense of self. And it is this thing which somehow has to exert via this interactionist approach or through an epiphenomenalist oddity, which I'm not sure many Christians would hold to, or sort of this psychophysical parallelism where they exist in sort of alternate dimensions, were it to be, if you want to think of it that way. How can we causally reduce these mental states in such a way that we can maintain the Christian faith? Well, here's where I think the position of emergent dualism that Hasker raises is a fascinating sort of middle ground here with the monist position. That is, the soul is an emergent substance that is dependent upon the body for its existence. So you don't have souls existing without bodies. There is an intermediate between substance dualism and this monistic view, in the sense that what happens is that the soul and the sense of self and all of these moral capacities and religious capacities and rational capacities emerge out of the structure and function of the brain, but they're not reducible to them. But these things have to be present in order for all of these to be manifest. But they are of a different type. They're not just a matter of degree, they're a difference of type. It is a consequence not of the configuration of the molecules in the sense that you could have crystallization, for example, occurring with some elements, but it emerges and it comes into being. The example that Hasker uses, I think, is an interesting one. I'm not quite sure what to make of it, but that of magnets, for example. If you get enough iron together, eventually it will generate a magnetic field. And he says, if you get enough neurons together and they're organized in such a way, it will generate sort of conscious mental states. And much as you can take magnets and sort of move them closer or further away from each other or change their polarity, so these mental states can also, as you bring those magnets closer to each other, they will push back against each other and change the orientation of that magnet in physical space. That's, I think, what he's trying to argue here. Hasker, I think, would want to say that this is certainly compatible with evolutionary theory. I think it's a very interesting premise. And that we can go ahead and sort of say that this is one way that the questions between science and faith certainly play themselves out. But I think at the end of the day, dualists are dualists. And dualists are what I like to call pragmatic dualists. I tend to be a pragmatic dualist. I think most people are. We deal with the world in a pragmatic way that assumes that we have souls and that we have minds, and we go about sort of interacting with each other and treating each other as moral agents. It fits very nicely in the way that we like to think about what happens after we die, right? I mean, it's much more comfortable to think of your grandfather or your grandmother being somewhere else, right, when they die, than it is to think that they are gone and that they've returned to dust, even though that is what the Church tells us, is that we do return to dust every Lent. I know we go forward for the ashes. Remember, you are dust, to dust you shall return. But in many other religions, this is a very common way of thinking about it and dealing with the psychological distress, you could argue, of what do we do when we have someone who dies? Or what about the fear of our own death, that existential angst that comes when we think about our own mortality? Well, it's much more comfortable to think about myself as existing beyond this physical state. So it does have some very significant psychological benefits. It does seem to fit very nicely with, I think, with intuitively the way that many people work, but it does also tend to lend itself towards a practical Gnosticism, which many people do in fact function. And we do know that Gnosticism is in fact heretical in the Christian tradition. This is the Orthodox Christian tradition, as decreed by the Council of Nicaea. And it really it forces us to reconsider the placement of the body in theological anthropology. We do not want to denigrate the current world, that the current world is in fact God's creation. It is good. It is worth investigating. there is something inherently good about our bodies. We don't need to be overly focused on saving souls, but I'll give an anecdotal bit of evidence here, if you allow that to be evidence. A woman I knew who had breast cancer had a double mastectomy. And she had both of her, obviously had her breasts removed. And after the surgery, she said, "I don't quite feel whole." Now, nothing neurologically was done to her. There's nothing neurological at all that was done to her, presumably. They didn't go in and take out an extra bit of, pineal gland or anything like that. But she said that the change to her body, in fact, affected her sense of self, her sense of who she was. And I think that is important to remember, that Jesus didn't become incarnate as a brain and wander around without a body, and that the brain does not exist somehow independent from the body. In many ways, that's the beautiful thing about the brain, is that it is capable of receiving inputs, yes, from the internal world, but is also constantly sending and receiving information to and from other organs in the body. The brain doesn't work if the heart doesn't do its job, if the kidneys don't do their job. So we want to be very careful about somehow giving the brain a position of superiority that goes beyond its merit. I think that we need to be very careful about that. And I'll mention one more thing about that a little bit later. But what about the monists? Yes, there are some Christian monists out there. You do find them, at least I tend to find them, only in those who have scientific backgrounds. I've yet to meet a monist who is a confessing Christian who does not have significant training in science. And if you know of any, I'd love to meet them, individuals who don't. But to me, the monist position is probably best represented by Malcolm Jeeves, Nancy Murphy, Warren Brown. I'm sure you've read of them before. This whole, it's almost a research program of non-reductive physicalism. The view that human persons are not two substances, they're one. However, our psychological experiences have downward causal properties. This, I think, is a very interesting thing, because it ties into what was mentioned earlier about the notion of supervenience and emergence. And it is certainly influenced by by the research in the neurosciences. Goodness, Malcolm Jeeves and Warren Brown are some of the most renowned experts on agenesis of the corpus callosum and many other things. And Nancy Murphy certainly is heavily influenced by them. And of course, I think if you want to do a thought tree or an academic sort of tree, Donald Mackay certainly has a significant place on that tree as well. Many of us, I think, would argue that we are significantly affected by Mackay's thoughts. And if we bring them back to the interpretation of Scripture, which is where I think both Warren Brown and Nancy Jeeves, as well as, Warren Brown, Nancy Murphy, and Malcolm Jeeves, sorry, too many names there. I think they all want to push back to the theologians and say, are you really sure that this is a dualistic perspective? Are you certain that these passages should be interpreted this way? Because if all God's truth is God's truth, we've got some major problems here with God's truth. Because one version of it is saying one thing, the Phineas Gages of the world, the individuals who have the tumors that act out sexually, people who have Alzheimer's, whose cortex degenerates. I mean, do you really want to go the way of saying that who you are when you die is what you go on into the eschaton? I really hope that if I do develop Alzheimer's, that it's not that Alzheimer's version of me that God remembers into the new body. That in some ways that it's the version of me that is somehow freed from a lot of that season of dementia that is remembered. Maybe I remember part of that. Maybe that's important. Maybe the eschaton is not about getting rid of all of our cognitive and moral scars, because in many ways those are the things that define who we are. And they can be redeemed. So they're pushing back and they're saying, this is what's going on in the brains. Are you really sure that this is what Scripture is teaching us? And it would not be the first time that theologians had to go back to Scripture because of what science had sort of brought to the table and brought to the conversation. But I do think we need to be very, very cautious, though, as we are looking at these notions of supervenience, where you have mental events supervening, being mapped onto physical events rather than mental events being inherently reducible to physical events. So, a person, for example, who might have a psychosomatic disorder, where they're feeling pain that really isn't there, that there's a cognitive process in the way that they are trying to manage the stress in their life, and it manifests itself as pain. And you find, if you go down into their bodies, that perhaps there might be some inflammatory agents that are being released in the skin. Brown tends to go, certainly to Mackay's work, to look at this sort of causal looping and executive cortical feedback circuits. And if I can get this, I think the physicists have me on all of their 10 to the 120 power zeros there. But the human brain is pretty impressive. It's got 100 million neurons, each of which can have anywhere between 1 and 10,000 synapses, which gives us about 100 trillion synapses. Or as I like to say in the States, $100 trillion converted into, sort of neurological stimulus packages, economics there. We had okay, that's a bad cultural joke, I guess.
Typing error, it should be 160 to 100 billion neurons.
I believe it's 60 to 100 million neurons is the data that I've seen. I could be wrong on that, but yeah, when I last checked my notes, it was 60 to 100 million. It's quite a bit, nonetheless. It's quite a bit. But I think the problem is when we get to the issue of it being numbers of neurons rather than potential connections. Because when we start thinking about the complexity of the connectivity, it becomes, to my mind, even more fascinating than just the sheer volume of, if you look at a box of sand and you think of it as just the number of grains of sand in it, and that can be remarkably impressive. If you think of how that sand could have the silicon extracted from it and then have how many different stories written onto it as text files, to me, I think is very, very interesting. And so I think the issue is it's a lot. I don't think that we're debating that. But this notion of how neurons can be wired back together, and this is an example of just a very simple wiring diagram for a lobster stomagastric neurons, how they're connected with one another and how they elicit gastric responses, interneurons. And then we complicate that with, as was mentioned earlier, if you just look at the simple system for vision, where light comes in through the retina, is transduced, so you have a changing of something, from one state to a different state, from light now to neurochemical energy. It is sent back from the retina to the lateral geniculate nucleus, from the lateral geniculate nucleus, then via the optic radiation back to the V1 layer of cortex, and then all heck breaks loose. Stuff starts going in every direction, and it starts feeding back down on itself. It is an incredibly complex system. So it's very easy to see how the potential for supervenience and emergence is found here in the brain. Now, just to give you an example, this is an example from Edelman's lab. Let me just switch out here, so if you bear with me for just a moment. If you look at, this is an example of a sort of a computer model of thalamocortical activation. And on one side here you can see sort of black dots and red dots, black dots being inhibitory signals, red dots being excitatory signals. And if you watch how, as we move away from the gyrus being represented to it being removed, you almost can see how there are waves of cortical activity that sort of spread out from different regions as they move along here. You'll see that there's sort of a cascade of activity. And to try to get to a place where you are dealing with, one neuron going from A to B to C, it's not that simple. It's one neuron is receiving potentially 10,000 inputs, which is influencing it to be a part of a larger wave, which could influence the way that other waves, via spatial and temporal summation, influence the overall activity of the cortex. Now, have we got it figured out yet? Have we kind of solved the problem here? No, we haven't. But we do have a very interesting new way of thinking about what's going on in the cortex when we have psychological states. These psychological states can be induced externally by viewing something, by listening to something, or they can be generated internally as sort of cortical waves cascade across the deeper layers of the brain as well, not just the cortex, but deeper layers stream up, deeper layers stream downward towards the spinal cord, and as this becomes sort of a symphony of cortical communication, it really is very beautiful. Now, getting back to our issue of mind-brain, have we solved the problem? Certainly not, but we do have a very interesting new way of thinking about it, this language of emergence and supervenience. So when we consider the program that's been put forth by this notion of top-down causation within the non-reductive physicalist approach, I think it's very realistic. And I think that from a psychological standpoint, I want to say, well, yeah, we kind of knew that. That's psychological data. That's what cognitive science tells us. That's what psychologists have been studying for over 100 years, is that things that happen at a cognitive level can affect us biologically. The fact that I am standing here in Cambridge giving this talk, there is a level of cortisol in my system that would not be present if I were doing it at Sunday school back in Wheaton, Illinois. It's very different. You all are very intimidating. So I will respond to the context of this situation in one way that affects my physiology. I would also argue that this afternoon, when I talk again, I will probably have less cortisol because I will have done this already. That I will neurologically now have adapted to the context, and that this can occur. One example that Warren Brown often uses is that cognitive behavioral therapy actually does change the level of serotonin receptors in the cortex and in the basal ganglia in the same way that just straight up usage of antidepressants does. So this notion of talk therapy, which doesn't seem to be very neurobiological, does have neurobiological consequences. I would say that if you properly understand everything cognitive has at the very least a neurobiological component, which gives it now the ability to change you at this level. So I really liked what Dr. Clark put up earlier, but I would like to argue that perhaps this is a bidirectional relationship. That yes, genes do affect cells, yes, atoms do affect molecules, molecules come together to go all that way up, but from a neurological perspective, yes, membrane potential does affect the nerve membrane and how it responds across the nerve. Yes, this does affect that neuron, this complex multipolar neuron. Yes, that neuron is wired into an assembly. Yes, you can have assemblies of assemblies and complex assemblies, which then can become phase sequences across the cortex and across multiple regions of the brain. And that these can also generate cognitive states. They can sort of influence whether or not I am outgoing or introverted in this setting and how you respond to that. If you are, let's say, falling asleep, or you're smiling, or you're daydreaming, or you're looking, wherever, that will influence how I interpret what's going on. And that will then be now going in the downward sense, in that the stimuli has a phase sequence, which then affects everything at a lower level. And if I can just sort of go off on one final tangent here, much of my research looks at genetic expression in response to environmental changes. The environments that we're put in, the things that we eat, the drugs that we take, the way that we interact with each other, activate genes. That's nothing new. We've kind of known that. So the whole notion of top-down causation as being a part of this system, for me, I want to say, well, yeah, we kind of knew that. It's nice that everyone else is sort of on board to it. But it's a bidirectional process. It's not just a bottom-up process. It's a top-down process. It's a reciprocal process as well. And so the opportunity for conversation on how we get the supervenience, how we get this emergence, I think, is at a really interesting point in time where we can have that conversation. As long as we're not too dogmatic about the brain Right? You don't find many reductive materialists who are Christians. You don't seem to find many. You do find them as atheists. But you don't find many Christians who are reductive materialists. So we're going to go ahead and sort of exclude them from the conversation, acknowledging that that is an entirely different way of thinking about it that you can be internally consistent with. But I do think you want to be careful to not become a neuroessentialist, because getting back to the importance of the body as well, we don't just want to think that you're really just your brain. As long as your brain's okay, you're okay. We want to make sure that we avoid this neuroessentialism. Yes, it is tied to personhood, to rationality, all those things that we like about being human, all of our psychological experience. But we do not want to ignore the integrative aspect of what it means to be human. And I believe that's where I will end. So thank you very much. If I could just interject one more thing. If you're interested in more of the neurology, I will be talking more about that this afternoon.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I'm sure there are plenty of questions on that. Yes, Emilio.
Yes. I'm not a professional theologian, but I think there
Neither
is
am I.
maybe a good way to put light on the dualism tradition in Christian history is, I think, the context of dualism is somehow related to the Arian controversy of the 3rd and 4th century, and how Christ could be God and man simultaneously. So the idea of nature and person comes in that play. And I think dualism shouldn't be interpreted as a separate entity. I mean, soul and body is the same. I mean, it's not the same thing, but it's put in the same person. They are not. It's the person that is responsible with soul and body, not two things that are separated. So I don't think, if I am correctly understanding your idea of brain and body as something different, or do you identify soul as brain, or could you?
Well, I think that the question gets to the Arian controversy, getting to the issue of the nature of Christ. And I think that we need to be very careful about ascribing too much of who Jesus is to who we are. I think that is kind of one of the true mysteries of the incarnation, is that Jesus is both fully God and fully man. I am not, but through some sort of mystery that the Spirit of God indwells in me. We need to be very careful about that. I tend to be, on these kinds of matters, tend to be rather winsomely agnostic. I don't really feel the need to declare myself openly as any one of these things, because I don't think that a theological anthropology is necessarily salvific. I think that as a person of Christian faith, the core of the Christian message is not inherently about the matters of theological anthropology. They're more about, I think, the story of God, and the story of God becoming man and coming to dwell among us. So for me, I tend to be very willing to engage all of these, and not necessarily feel that I have to adopt a position of non-reductive physicalism. I'm very sympathetic towards it. I think I really enjoy. I think that's one of the beauties in this area, is that you can be curious about all these things if you don't necessarily have a theological stake in them. Mm-hmm. And I don't. So I'm not sure if that entirely gets to the issue, but I do think that there is something about this substance dualism does have its ties to that event in Christian history and the establishment of doctrine.
No, what I'm saying is that, to me, the correct interpretation of dualism in that context is that body and soul are part of the same thing, the person.
Yeah.
So I think this idea of the car is something that was elaborated much further in history.
Oh, certainly.
Initially, I think nobody really, in the Christian tradition, understood body as something out of the body, let's say. I mean, soul as something out of the body, but two aspects that are in the same entity, which is the person.
Yeah, and I believe it was Aquinas who sort of addressed that as well, and had the notion of infusion, that the soul was somehow infused into the body, and that at the point of infusion it's somehow in a unique way not separable anymore from the body. So yeah, I didn't mean to, certainly there's a lot more, there's certainly much more than what I presented. But I think when you are looking, certainly in the Western world, and certainly within the last 500 years, it would be a mistake to ignore the effect that Descartes had on much of what's happened since the 16th century. But yes, there are many other ways of thinking about this. This is certainly not comprehensive and certainly not exhaustive, but just one perspective.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes.
Thanks, William. I have a twofold question. It relates to the understanding of the image that you referred to earlier on. Do any of these understandings attach any significance to the idea of the likeness and the image of God? That's one. And is there a bodily aspect of the image regarding any of these understandings?
Is there a bodily understanding of the image?
Bodily aspect.
Bodily aspect.
In the sense that human beings being bipedal, as some have suggested before, being human. And my reasoning is, if we had a soul, why would we need a resurrected body?
Okay. I want to make sure that I have a very short attention span. The first question was about the body?
It was about the distinction between likeness and
Oh, I'm sorry. So the distinction between likeness and image, I think it's critical because there are two. Scripture does use two different words. They are very different words, and I'm not really sure. But I'm confident though that when if you want to look at at least from my tradition, from my Christian tradition, that the purpose of human life is to be conformed to the image of Christ. That would be really difficult if image meant numerical identity or a high degree of physical similarity. And I was a woman because Jesus was presumably male. And so that would be a significant sort of impediment there. Now, being a woman would still make you part of the human race, perhaps. And so I think the next, perhaps, it does. I get in trouble with my students for calling women human females. So I think there is an important distinction there because the notion of likeness is critical. I will not be who Jesus is. I can bear his image, but the degree to which I can make that image clear, I think, speaks to the issue of likeness. I maybe can grow facial hair. I'm 39, so I am at very least 6 years older than he was when he was approximately when he was crucified. So I think the issue of likeness deals with some of these cognitive dispositions that we have. One thing that came up in a conversation earlier, I can't remember who it was, earlier in the week. For me, much of the mind of Christ, or the cortex of Christ, or the neural integration of Christ, is about compassion. And it's not necessarily about having the right rules to sort of what would Jesus do sort of bracelets that people wear over in the States, to know the right answer to every question. It is much tied to something that's much simpler than that. So I think that gets to the issue of image and likeness. Now your second issue I think was attached to the importance of body, right? I do think it is very interesting that Jesus comes as Homo sapiens, that he doesn't come as a chimpanzee, that he doesn't, he's not incarnated as some other form of being. I don't know what to make of that. I'll just be honest about that. I'm not quite sure. He doesn't come with 4 legs. He doesn't come with 7 ears. He comes in the form that we have. Those are much sharper and more clever theological minds to answer that question than me.
Thank you. Yes.
There's this theory that came from the United States about the emergence of thought. It was called the confabulation theory.
I'm vaguely familiar with it.
Yeah, so based on that, what the scientists could do, what they could do is they could actually generate a computer simulations program, and they could feed in sentences and actually show that intelligent answers could emerge.
Yeah. Okay.
That's one.
Right.
Secondly, in Switzerland, I think a colleague of Professor Clark, Henry Markram, his laboratory has shown that they could, again, in silico, they could actually show emergent behavior from a neural behavior. So, in those cases, would you say that the mind-body, it's out of body? the emergence of spontaneous activity? I don't know.
Well, I think we're getting into a different arena here. I think we're getting into the nature of evidence again. And I'll speak a little bit more on that this afternoon, the issue of first-order evidence, or first-person evidence, and third-person evidence. One of the things that we do see, certainly in the neurosciences as well as more broadly psychology, is the importance of similarity between humanity and what we're willing to ascribe minds to. So, for example, to use the example of, in Star Trek, the Commander Data, I think is a common one. If you had an android, if you built the computer in such a way that it had a face that was neotenous, would you ascribe personhood to it? I think most people would say, well, I'm much more willing to, but the information that I have about it, because it is dissimilar from the way that I am built and what we know about human beings, many would still be a little reticent about it, but they wouldn't be near as reticent if it looked neotenous, if it looked like us. So I think that's a philosophical issue, and much of it depends on which sort of epistemological stakes you're wanting to put in the ground about what counts as evidence and whether or not it's possible. Once again, it's one of those areas where I tend to be agnostic, so I'm not an original thinker by any means. I just enjoy sort of thinking about what are the logical conclusions to this. I do think, however, you could take a position that could be compatible with the Christian faith that says that there may come a time when we can build a sort of self-sustaining machine, to a certain extent, that has consciousness in a way that is remarkably similar to the way that we have it. And I don't necessarily think that in any way that threatens the Christian faith at all. It's an interesting concept. And if you have too many theological stakes in the ground, I think that it becomes a problem. But if you only have a few theological stakes in the ground and theological commitments, I don't think it's a threat to the Christian faith at all.
If that's possible, would that end the mind-body problem, really? Because it's out of body, so
I
it's
think-
no more in the body.
I think it would change I just think it would change the question. I think it would become a different question. So.
Yeah.
I wanted to sort of ask a question about your discipline. I'm a sociologist, and how live are these conversations about the mind as being something more than just the reduction of its parts or just a collection of neurons in your discipline more broadly?
In psychology?
Yeah, I'm interested to know, or is this a conversation that's mainly taking place in theological circles and it's not a conversation that's taking place in the discipline more broadly? Because in my own discipline, there's a huge fracture along these lines, the sort of desire to have cultural explanations of things versus sort of rationalistic explanations for human behavior.
I might be the wrong person to ask, because as a biological psychologist, I am not representative of the larger discipline of psychology. My impression of psychologists is that the majority of them are clinical psychologists, and so they're much more interested in doing therapy or something like that. The majority of experimental psychologists that are out there, this is not on the radar. Now, I think for the more elite academics out there, the more higher level scholars, it is something of interest, and certainly a good amount is being generated at it. But as far as speaking as a cultural, on a cultural level among psychologists, certainly in the States, we're a little more preoccupied with sort of getting insurance funding for treating different types of disorders, for working with the socio-political ramifications of the issues of sexuality. These kinds of core, deep issues about mind-brain they're not dead, but they're certainly nowhere near as rich as they probably were, I would say, 20 years ago. Now, I could probably add one more thing. Those people who are interested in are coming at it from my angle, are coming from the neuroscience and beginning to say, hey, we've got a new way to think about this. We need to start asking some new questions here. We have some new data that we'd like to contribute to the conversation, which is why I think you've seen a split in the States between the American Psychological Association, which is overwhelmed by clinicians, and the American Psychological Society, which has a large contingent of experimental psychologists, whether they be cognitive scientists or more broadly, neurological, neuroscientists. So that there's been a little bit of a fracture, but less on the issue, on this kind of an issue, more on the playing out of the profession of being a psychologist.
Thank you. Stephen.
Conversations look different, not just in different disciplines, I think, but in different languages.
Yes.
You know, one problem I think with aggregating theological anthropology is it'll look different whether you do it with reference to New Testament Greek, German, Polish, English. And, you know, Wittgenstein talked about the way in which many of our philosophical problems are really linguistic confusions. And while I wouldn't go all the way with that, I think it has some pertinence in this particular context. I could give a particular example if you want, but I'll even do so. But it's interesting to find that the debate will just not be set up in the same way in every language.
I can't agree any more with you. I think that is one of the major problems. I think that as human beings, when we look at the way that the brain does work, and we look at language, if you want to use the computer metaphor, language is sort of, in many ways, the operating system for much of what goes on in the mental life. And I think that the categories that we develop, much as as you grow, you sort of lose the ability to hear phonemes from other languages. By the age of, I think it's 5, being raised in an English-speaking household, I've lost the ability to pick up some of the inflection that I might pick up in a tonal language. The limitations that language place on us certainly have to be considered in this. And being a good American, I only really speak one language well. So I think that that is one limitation that I would certainly acknowledge. That as I read a little bit of Latin, a little bit of German, but as I go to the Greek and the Hebrew, I'm forced to rely on the linguists, on the biblical scholars, to give me the best English approximations of what this is, and that limits my ability to sort of philosophically work out some of these issues in a way that if I were speaking Welsh, or if I were speaking German, or I were speaking Hebrew or French, I'm sure I would come at it with a more nuanced perspective that would be very different. But if I only spoke French, I might miss some of the nuances that I see in English. So I would just say, yeah, you're spot on that.
And if you should speak Welsh, my friend, you need nothing else.
I wanted to make sure I had
Question right at the back. Yes.
At one moment in your talk, you made a comparison between human beings, or you tried to equate human beings with persons, and you said that, well, I don't like this concept, it's too static for me. I prefer a much more dynamical concept. And I wonder if you can elaborate a bit about the concept of person, because it wasn't clear for me if it's a theological concept or another kind of concept. Because if it's theological, the way I understand it is a bit different. From a theological point of view, I think this concept has at least two meanings. One is relational, which refers to the relation between in between divinity, the three persons, and the second one is very technical. It's hypostasis, which implies that you can have two natures under the same person. So person in this meaning has nothing to do with what we are tempted to think, like individual in a society, or reason, or even soul. It's a very technical concept coming from the Greek philosophy.
Yes.
So I wonder if you can elaborate a bit about the concept of person you use there, and what do you think exactly about becoming on static there?
Well, I think I used the term in very much a layperson's fashion. I think that is one of the problems, is that we do have so many terms, and each of these terms mean very different things in different disciplines. So, for example, as a psychologist, I would say my notion of persons is very different than the one that you described from theology. Is very much what I would say is a cognitive ascription of social standing. And this has a whole number of things that kind of fall into place, that they are morally responsible, that they will have at least a certain amount of shared experience that I have, that they are self-contained. So I think that the issue of the manner in which I think your question was, what was I meaning by persons, was very much as I think a layperson's understanding of it as an individual human being. But the nuances between how all of these things are used, whether it be I punched the mirror, my brain made me do it, all the nuancing of that, that is where the theologians and the philosophers really get us into an awful lot of difficulty. And even in psychology, we get into those sort of problems as well. I don't even want to go off in Freudian psychodynamic theory about different notions of the self. But I do think that there is something about, more broadly speaking, across a lot of those understandings of what it means to be a human being, that there's this perception of continuity, that there's a static sense that many people have, that who I am today in some ways is connected to who I was yesterday and is very, very similar. And that is a very static view of what it means to be a person. And I think is very much tied to sort of the classic substance dualism, where you're really a soul, you can't destroy the soul, it's of a different type, it's a different substance, and it has that same continuous nature that it continues on and carries on. So, but that is the difficulty when you're working in this kind of a group, where you have many people from many different disciplines that understand these terms very differently.
Yes, good point. Okay, there's a question over there.
Last few years, Harvard University has been doing some research on the aberrational concept of the medicine wheel. And the Aboriginal societies add the heart as one element of the human being, in addition to the mind, body, and soul, so that there be four aspects, and all four aspects have equal status. How does that concept fit into what you've been describing for us?
Well, I think at the end of the day, it's the ontological issue is there's either one thing or there's more than one thing. And the problems that you have with dualism, you will find with trichotomism, that you'll find with if you had 4 things or 5 things or whatever. I think you're getting to issues of parsimony and the issue of Occam's razor, which is not that you start out with one thing and then build up on it, but you sort of shave away to get the bear of what you need. I would want to hear more about that actually before I comment on it, but to my mind, it seems to be the same issues that you would have with dualism, you would have with a trichotomist view, which is also another one that you do see in theological anthropology. You think of a person as body, soul, and spirit, that there is a distinction between soul and spirit that many theologians will in fact make, and I don't want to do a disservice to that, but you look at the language that's used in our culture, in U.S. culture, I think that I just sort of tried to narrow it down a bit. I barely got what I did in an hour. I suppose I probably could have organized it a little bit differently to get at things, but I would want to hear more about that. That sounds very interesting.
Good. More questions? Yes.
If someday a complete reductive explanation of the mind-brain connection could be made, do you think that would have the ability to wipe out rational people's ability to believe in God? Do you think it hinges somehow on our inability to, another God of the gaps situation where, this is why we can say there's a God, because we can't completely, explain the mind.
No, I think that the question is if we do get to a point where we can have a good, functional, sort of reductionistic account of psychological experience, do you think that sort of religion will sort of go the way of the dinosaur, so to speak? I do have one theological post in the ground, which is, I think even the atheists have some difficulty arguing that, which is the depravity of man. I do think that human beings are very good at doing bad things and deceiving themselves and deceiving others. I think it's part of who we are in this particular eschaton. I think it's, I'll chat a little bit more about that this afternoon. But I do think that it's just part of human nature I don't exist, and my cognitive experience is not at the level of the synapse. And even though I can see great explanations for, even now, for why I might think, I have great explanations for why I hold the theological beliefs that I do, that are not even neurological, they're entirely behavioristic. I still hold them. And even though there's a great behavioristic explanation for why I still hold them, to me it's just part of human nature to want to be exploring these things. I think it's one of the beautiful things about who we are, and it's part of God's creative nature as well. There's perhaps imaged, that we image. But I I don't think so. I think it's just part of being human to keep asking these kinds of questions, even if we do have good answers for them.
That wasn't quite my question.
Oh,
but
sorry.
the rest of it was. I just mean, say we can take raw materials and we can build a mind, you know, that's equivalent to the mind that you have today. You know, so we have a complete materialist explanation for the mind.
Oh.
Are we sort of using that as the last frontier, where we say this is where, you know, God acts, this is where we can't come up with a full explanation? And if so, and we can build mind out of raw materials, what does that do to our concept of God?
Well, I'm sorry, I did misunderstand your first question. I understand that. I think we do that. We do that when we have children. I mean, it's not identical to mine. I mean, just the fact that we can do it in a different way, I don't think that, I don't know about that. I mean, I think I have 3 of those. And I did those and I made them together with my wife. And it wasn't sitting down with, you know, plugs and putting them together. You know, it was a different process. And so I think that that's kind of the beauty of life as well, is that does happen. And even if I do, you know, get to a place where I can sit down and I can look at how that process occurred in all 3 of my children, I don't think my involvement in it or my ability to understand it somehow takes anything away from those 3 lives of my children.
Thank you. Yeah. It's been uneasy for a long time. The only tool that you have to investigate mind is mind. Your own mind.
Yes.
This sounds horribly self-referential and circular to me. How sure are you of your ground when you are investigating mind with your own?
Well, I think that's where this afternoon, I think when I speak about consciousness, I'll deal with that particular issue, because at one point I tried to correct myself in my talk in this sort of very modern view that we can have an objective knowledge of sort of reality is really not the right way of thinking about it. I think the issue is more of intersubjectivity, that we do infer that when we get together, and that is the wonderful thing about science, that we do not have to rely solely on our own first-person perspective, that we are relying on others, that when I see something that is the same thing you see, and recognizing that when I look through my microscope and I see the little black dots, that I understand it as one thing, and my wife looks at the little black dots and she sees them as little black dots, right? Not as the connection between, you know, the cingulate cortex and the basal ganglia, which are generated and activated in response to novel environments, that I interpret it in one way, and she doesn't have the ability to do that. That's a philosophical problem, which really gets at the core of epistemology, which is getting back to, once again, those brute facts, that you do have to kind of put your stake in the ground on some issues. Otherwise, you slide into a solipsism and you really can't do anything.
Dennis has a question, which might just be the last one.
Well, I just want to make a comment on the previous one, actually, about this whole thing of making synthetic brains and whether we would recognize them as minds. And because we're having a discussion last night about the same thing in the context of a cell, which is one cell is a lot simpler than one brain, for sure. So, and then, you know, so, but I wonder if it might not be the case that the only way, if you wanted to make a synthetic brain, actually, the only way to do it would be in the kind of material that brains are made of, actually. And so, you know, the whole notion of, in terms of we want a brain that would create a mind, that we would recognize the minds and respond to as minds, forget sort of the funny face on the front, what do we put? But it seems to me that that might be the case. We don't know this, but I mean, it's an interesting thought experiment. That the only way to do that actually is of, you know, carbon-based materials, and it so happens, well, that's what brains are made of. So, and given the compactness and the amount of information content within these 10 to the 13, 10 to 11 neurons and so forth, it just seems to me that that might be the case. In which case, then we come back to the point you made, that actually there are very simple ways of making brains in that way. But I think, you know, some people are, when they think about synthetic brains, are sort of thinking about computer material and in silico, all kinds of things. And it may just be that we don't have the ability to create minds in that kind of material. You know, the materials themselves don't lend themselves to that kind of emergent phenomenon. And the emergent phenomenon we do find actually happens to be made of stuff, you know, neurons, biological squidgy stuff. So I just make that as an extra point to the discussion.
I think it's a very good point, and I think it's probably a point on which we ought to stop for lunch. So let's go for